Go. We're back to persuasion. Persuasion can occur in different mediums. Of course, you can, it can be in writing, it can be on the radio, it could be, on television or something. And it turns out that, I'm trying to persuade somebody. What should my, what should I use for my medium? And it turns out that, say, if you were trying to, remember this one up in here, where was it? Here I am. If you're trying to sell this product, this, I forgot what it was called, Beowulf cluster, right? If you're trying to sell a Beowulf cluster, now that is a hard message, all right? It takes an awful lot of thought. And it turns out that if you're trying to sell a Beowulf cluster, don't try selling it on the radio. It isn't going to work, okay? Even television just isn't going to cut it. If it's a difficult message, people need to be able to stop and think and really put the time to reread it into it. But if it's a very, very easy message or an easy thing to sell, then it turns out that having it on video is the best way to be persuaded, because it's simple and you just look for a flashy, pretty face or whatever, and it's a simple one. All right. Different people are persuaded in different ways. I don't know, let it go. How about this? If you warn somebody ahead of time, then they're much more likely to be able to counter-argue you, all right? Distraction disarms counter-arguing. I like this. This is interesting. Good story for you. I remember when I was newlywed with my wife, and we were out shopping for our first car together. We had a car, my car. So we were going out to buy a car, and we were in New York, Long Island, New York, and we had my baby there. The baby was about 1 year old, something like that, a little over 1, and he was being bad that day. He was just not being a good kid. And this little sleazy car salesman, I know, sleazy car salesman. Oh, what a terrible stereotype. This sleazy car salesman saw my son, who was being a little crap that day, saw my son as a tool to help him try to sell me a car. That little bastard of a car salesman totally tried to get me to sign a contract that would have ended up making me pay way more than we were agreeing to in person. He tried to sneak it through using some funky, fancy techniques. He truly saw my son being this distraction as a tool for him to help sell his product. And thank God that I'm smarter than that, okay? You can't throw some fake math on me, buddy. I'll work that one out, okay? In fact, just to keep the story straight, I didn't feel right, so I said, let me think about it, let me take it home. And as soon as I got it home and put the numbers into my computer, it was wrong. It was way wrong. And I went back to him, and I even confronted him. And he said, my job is to sell you a car. My job is to make the most money I possibly can at it. Why are you blaming me? And I'm like, because you lied to me. You said the price was going to be $15,000, and then when you did all of that funky math on paper, it's $23,000. What, are you kidding me? That's lying. Whatever, okay? So, be careful. There are scumballs out there. All right. So anyway, uninvolved audiences tend to use, as we said, peripheral cues, but there is a personality factor. Remember, we've talked about psychological constructs. Some of the constructs are things like intelligence, right? Obviously. And you measure intelligence using an IQ test, and you get a score or something. But there's many other psychological constructs. One of those constructs is called need for cognition. That is to say, how much you need to think and analyze about things versus just going with it, okay? People that are high in need for cognition are much more likely to be persuaded using the central route. People that score low on the need for cognition are much more likely to be persuaded by peripheral cues. Just as a very quick thing, here's a couple of questions from the need for cognition scale. Thinking is not my idea of fun. If you agree with this, chances are you're quite low in need for cognition. I like tasks that require little thought once I've learned them. If you score high on these two questions, chances are you are much more likely to be persuaded by the peripheral route than the central route. Blah, blah. Move on. All right, cults. Now we're going to talk about those cults, okay? Remember now, a cult is kind of funky because Some people would argue that the military is a cult. Some people would argue that the Catholic Church is a cult. Some would argue that the Methodist Church is a cult. Give us our due, right? But anyway, a group typically characterized by distinctive ritual beliefs related to its devotion to a god or a person, isolation from the surrounding evil culture, and a charismatic leader. These are just characteristics that make a cult. But again, the very definition of a cult, just like the definition of propaganda, really is dependent upon who you ask. Okay? So, how can a cult indoctrinate somebody? Okay? People, they internalize commitments. That is to say, if you make a voluntary public commitment and you do so repeatedly, you tend to internalize that. So the goal of these cults is to get you, okay? In fact, we had said, I believe we had said at one other point, or maybe it's coming up later, whatever. I think we said it when we were talking about Nazi Germany. But anyway, turns out that if you, let's say, for example, once in a while, I'll put up a little scenario. You've got one kid on the bus that kids are making fun of. And there's one boy on the bus, he's a good kid. But you know what? He wants to fit in with everybody else, so he starts to make fun of this kid. He doesn't have anything, there's nothing. I don't hate you for any reason, but my behavior is such that I'm making fun of him. Very, very quickly, the very act of behaving in that manner will change the internal beliefs. And that's what the cults are going to take advantage of. If you simply do things, very soon you'll come to believe those things. So what they'll do is they'll try to give you very simple things to begin with. Say, for example, here, the foot in the door phenomenon. The recruiters begin with simple things. Let me take you out to dinner, a free dinner. Let me, a getaway weekend or something. Then at first it would be like monetary offerings are voluntary. Just put in $1. That's all I'm asking is $1. And the very act of committing these behaviors leads us to believe what goes behind them. Okay? So what is it that helps a cult to indoctrinate people? A good communicator. The leader must be very good communicator. Jim Jones, if anybody remembers Jim Jones, he led the cult that went down to French Guiana, I believe, and established a compound down there. And when, basically it went like this then. The relatives of the people in the cult hired to get up private, I think they hired up convinced the FBI that the people were being held against their will. And so the FBI went down to arrest and to disassemble this cult, this compound down in French Guiana, I believe it is, in South America. And as the authorities were coming in, Jim Jones sets this up, and he sets up these vats of Kool-Aid, and he puts poison in them, and he convinces his followers to drink all of the Kool-Aid. And so perhaps you've heard the phrase, don't drink the Kool-Aid. Well, that's what it's referring to. Don't just blindly follow other people. Stop and think about it. All right? Just like that. Okay, whatever. The message, too. Often an emotional message. You shower some lonely follower with love, Cult members tend to be younger. They tend to be more impressionable. They tend to be facing crises in their lives. Audience members tend to be, they tend to have poor connections with family members. They tend to not have a lot of support. And so what happens is, of course, the cult's job is to offer this support, to give this support to you that needs it. All right. So, anyway, here it is. Who says? Elements of the communicator that can increase the message. What is the content? Know your audience. How is it passed along? Depends on the method, the message being passed. And who is it? Okay. But otherwise, also, cults typically separate members. Any previous social support networks, very soon they try to make their group into family. Okay. You don't need that family anymore. You have our family. Okay. Only engage socially. Any other communication is strongly discouraged, if not openly forbidden. The group creates their identity. It defines their reality. It defines who they are. And very soon they can't even remember what life is like before this. there is absolute consensus in a cult, and what happens, of course, is it's on the surface. We'll talk about groupthink a little later, but clearly there's going to be situations where it looks like everybody in the room is agreeing to things, but in the end, they're not really agreeing to things, okay? People just are looking at everybody else going, well, he's not disagreeing, and he's not disagreeing, so they must all agree, okay? So what the cult does is attempts to, anybody that disagrees, you just real quickly put that down to maintain the illusion that you have consensus. But as I said, a lot of these techniques that are used by the Catholic monasteries, military, fraternities, sororities, all kinds of different places do the same stuff. So does that make them a cult? I don't know. I mean, it depends on who you ask, right? And it's the same thing, in fact, in group therapy sessions. In different classes that I teach, I talk about sometimes in support groups in therapy, what happens is, well, how to keep it simple, that that symptoms are brought out because people want to fit in with the group, and the group defines what is acceptable, and it would be good if you had these symptoms or something like this. And I don't know, it happens kind of spontaneously. So how can we resist persuasion? All right? This is how. La, la, la. Don't listen, right? No, that's not going to work. Make a public commitment to your position. If you have a belief before going into it, I'll give you this. This is pretty straightforward. When my wife and I, we go on these vacations, and one of the first things you do is you look for the condominium salespeople, all right? Because, man, you can get some really good packages. When we were in Las Vegas, we got these awesome dinner shows. When we were in Hawaii, we got these diving trips and shit, like stuff like this. We got great stuff. But, of course, in order to get that great stuff, you have to sit through a message. And I'm a sucker. It's a good thing my wife is there, because she says right up front, she even tells the salesperson before they start, I'm not going to buy your product. Just like that, right to their face. And it's like, well, what's the point, right? But they have to sit there and do their presentation, and it's like an hour and a half, and they have to give you the tour and everything, and I'm not going to buy your product, just like that. And lo and behold, by making that public statement, that commits it even more. I mean, it's a good thing she was there, or I would have ended up with a condo in both Vegas and Hawaii, okay? But a very interesting thing here, attitude inoculation. Inoculation is like an immunization. You get injected with a low dose dead bacteria, and by doing so, it strengthens your immune system. Well, here's an interesting study that they did with little children, and they did the same kind of an inoculation. They took these kids in 7th grade, and what they did was they instead of a full-on disease, right? Instead of a full-on, your friend is now in your face saying, hey, let's smoke this cigarette. Instead, they were having them do role-playing and things like this. And they were teaching them, these different phrases. She's not really liberated if she's hooked on tobacco. I'd be a real chicken if I smoked, or something like this. And what happened is, by attacking them with a weak message, we find that up here in the 9th grade, those kids weren't smoking. But in the control school, where they did not inoculate them, there was some smoking. All right, it's time to take a break, and hopefully we can finish this up in one more segment. All right, see you in a few minutes.